Right. And so this is one of the things that people were kind of throwing around at this time, is this idea that, well, the heavens are totally silent. And even things like SETI and stuff like that are, this constant search for meaning, this hope that there's going to be some kind of a principality, some kind of a source of meaning beyond our own world. Right.
Yeah.
And it's a really deep human hope that ultimately should prepare us for Christ.
Hello, everyone. This is Seraphim Hamilton. I'm very excited today to be back with Richard Rohlin. Last time we had Richard on the channel, we were talking about the symbolism of the heavens in the Christian conception of the world. And in the preparation for that discussion, I asked Richard to send some books that were influential on his own thinking. And he mentioned the Cosmic Trilogy of C.S. Lewis, which was delightful because the Cosmic Trilogy are probably my favorite fictional works of all time. And in an interesting way, actually, I think they are my favorite non-fictional works of all time. They profoundly have shaped the way that I think about the world and I think about the heavens. And I think that was within Lewis's intention. So today, what we're going to be focusing on is the first book of the Cosmic Trilogy. This is not a spoiler-free discussion, by the way, but if you haven't read these books, you need to pick them up and read them.
It was published in 1943, people, so 81 years.
Yeah, you're past due. You're past due. So thanks for coming on, Richard.
Yeah, it's great to be here. This will be a lot of fun. The Space Trilogy is definitely one of my top works of fiction. It's probably my favorite work of fiction that not as many people have read. Obviously, I'm a big Lord of the Rings guy, and it's probably doubtful that anything will ever totally displace the Lord of the Rings in my own imagination, or even in kind of my public persona, which so much of which has been focused around speaking about Tolkien. But the Space Trilogy is hugely important. I think it's very important and very prescient in many ways for where we are today. They're not perfect books, from a storytelling aspect or from like a literary artistic standpoint. You could say that there are things, especially the third one, that could be done better, if Lewis had another crack at it. But all that said, there's nothing quite like them. I was rereading Out of the Silent Planet earlier today as preparation for these conversations, and I was just really struck and amazed at how beautiful and enjoyable this first one is. This is definitely the slowest one in the trilogy, and it's the one that a lot of people kind of get bored with, which seems silly to me because, for one thing, the book is just not very long.
Yeah,
it isn't The Hunchback of Notre Dame or War and Peace, or something where you can be like, this book is too long and I'm getting bored now. If you were sitting down reading start to finish, I think it would take most people just 4 or 5 hours to read all the way through this first book. Yeah. And I can very vividly remember reading it as an adult for the first time. I read these books when I was a kid, but I really revisited them again when I was an adult as part of reading, maybe either before or after I read The Discarded Image for the first time. And so this has been in my early 20s. And that's when I kind of came around to the books again and just really discovered them for being this tremendous treasure. Yeah. And I've been really pleased because I've been trying in vain for years to get people to read them. And pretty much only people in sort of like inkling scholarship circles seem to be familiar with them at all. And even like close friends of mine, I'm still on their case to read the books and they still have never done it.
Yeah.
But then within the last couple of years, it seems like everybody, what is sometimes called this little corner of the internet, that everybody suddenly discovered them and has started reading them and talking about them and appreciating them. And that's really delightful to me. I'm not trying to be hipster about this and be like, I was reading them before it was cool or whatever, because they've always been cool, but it's just, it's really delightful to me to see people digging into them. So I know there have been actually quite a number of Cosmic Trilogy discussions lately, but maybe we can make our contribution to the genre.
Yeah, I read Out of the Silent Planet for the first time when I was in 7th grade, so I was about 12 years old. Of course, I was raised on the Narnia books. My mom was an adult convert to Christianity, but she'd had the Narnia books around. She read them to me, and then, I just needed to find a book for a book report, and she handed me Out of the Silent Planet. And, when I heard this, like C.S. Lewis, who wrote fantasy, had written science fiction, I had no idea what I was in for. I didn't know much about C.S. Lewis beyond the Narnia books and beyond the fact that the Narnia books had Christian themes. And even at 12 years old, I was kind of taken by the way in which Lewis was able, I think, to integrate the concrete reality of the world that we're familiar with through a telescope, because that's the world in which we've kind of been saturated. Right. He integrated that with a world which was permeated by meaning and Christian truth in a way that really made it feel seamless. And so then when I came back to the books, I think I read them in my late teens, but then I remember I was 23, 24. I listened to the books on audiobook while I was taking long walks, and I was utterly enchanted with the world which they inhabited it. And one of the things that Lewis says about these books and about his work more broadly is that it's much easier to communicate to the unsuspecting reader Christian ideas if you do it in the form of a narrative which embeds those ideas in the structure than it is if you're writing like Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity, you kind of have to be receptive already. You're picking up this book, which is self-confessedly a work of apologetics, but Out of the Silent Planet, hey, this is a book about outer space. You don't exactly think you're going to find this stuff there.
Yeah, Lewis calls this sneaking past watchful dragons.
Yeah.
Right. And the watchful dragons are the things where we get our hackles up a little bit because we think we grew up hearing about this thing in Sunday school. And we get our hackles up because we're like, now I already know about all that Jesus stuff. It's my favorite example of this is when you have somebody who's like an atheist and they're like, oh, but I went to Catholic school, so I'm an expert on Christianity. Right. And then they proceed to throw in some kind of a take about Christianity which no sincere Christians ever held, or certainly no confessionally Orthodox body has ever believed in, or whatever. But yeah, so this idea of stealing past watchful dragons, it's interesting. I just had, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I just had a conversation a couple of days ago with Father Deacon Nicholas Kotar, who of course you'll be familiar with, and he's got actually a new kind of space opera book coming out. Actually, it might be hard sci-fi, I'm not sure, but he's got some kind of a sci-fi book coming out soon on Kickstarter. And so we had a conversation just about science fiction and cosmology and things like this, not really talking specifically about the space trilogy, but we ended up talking quite a bit about Narnia. And one of the things that he kind of put forward is something like Narnia works only because it was being written to people who, even if they weren't Christians anymore, they at least had enough of a shared Christian social imaginary that they were able to, that you could sort of like pick up on what's going on in Narnia. And so it's like, you need to be like kind of halfway along, whereas maybe something like Narnia wouldn't work for a contemporary audience, but something like the Cosmic Trilogy would. Certainly, I think if I were going to sit down and write a novel today, which I'm always in danger of doing, one of the things that I'd be really interested in doing would be kind of continuing something along the lines of what Lewis does in the Cosmic Trilogy. And specifically, this is something that was really resonating with me on this last read through. Lewis has a really great way of the way that Out of the Silent Planet in particular really resonates, or let's say interacts well with contemporary science fiction literature of the time. In particular, H.G. Wells's The First Men in the Moon, which has an incredibly similar plot for people who don't know. I've heard this Cosmic Trilogy described as Out of the Silent Planet is Lewis doing an H.G. Wells story, and That Hideous Strength is Lewis doing a Charles Williams story, and Paralandra is Lewis doing a Lewis story. It's certainly the case that Paralandra is Lewis's most, you could almost say, like, most honest of the three, like his most honest, and I think it's probably his second best novel after Till We Have Faces. In fact, I don't think there's any question about that. But Paralandra is the one that's kind of most authentic to Lewis's own style. Whereas with Out of the Silent Planet, he's really trying on the sort of the H.G. Wells voyage novel kind of a thing. And it's interesting, right at the same time, you had two major fathers of what eventually becomes the science fiction genre, although at the time they called it scientific fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. And they're both writing stories about lunar travel. But for Jules Verne, who hated The First Man in the Moon, he hated H.G. Wells' book, by the way. The reason that he hated it is that Verne was really concerned with modern technology and the application of it. And the sort of like, so all of his, you could say, optimism and sometimes also pessimism or satire, everything was all basically based in what he deemed as being sort of actually feasible by the technological standards of his day. So what you think of like a classic Jules Verne book like Around the World in 80 Days, or even something like Journey to the Center of the Earth, he's trying to show what he thinks would be possible based on the science and the technology of his time. So he was actually really annoyed that H.G. Wells wrote a story where somebody used fictional means to get to the moon. So for people who don't know, Jules Verne's version of the story has basically they build a huge gun in Florida, which is, and it's funny because they do like sort of predict certain things. Like they determine for various reasons Florida is a good place to launch yourself into space from. And they put together a giant nowadays it's actually called a Verne gun. It's named after him as one of the theories about how you could make space travel like more easily accessible or make it cheaper or something like that. So anyway, they make a huge basically a huge gun. They shoot themselves into space and they end up missing the moon a little bit, and so they don't actually land on the moon. They just sort of look at it through opera glasses, in other words binoculars, and then they circle back and eventually land on the Earth. There's a fun sequel. So that's actually 2 books. And then there's a fun sequel, just by the way, for people who don't know, called The Sail of the North Pole, which is kind of a satire. It involves the same characters, but it's a much more satirical, much more pessimistic view of like where the direction that science and industry are kind of headed in. And I promise you, this is actually relevant to something I want to say about Out of the Silent Planet. The thing that I'm trying to highlight is, you could say, the kinds of attitudes that are prevalent and that people are really arguing about, and even authors themselves seem to be conflicted about like the role of science and industry, space exploration, technology, all these different things. And so in the sequel to Jules Verne's 2 moon travel stories, the first one is just about building the gun and shooting themselves into space, and the second one is about orbiting the moon and then landing. In the third one, the 3 guys who originally shot themselves into space, they come out of retirement and they have this new plan to build a giant gun, like much larger, like underneath Mount Kilimanjaro, and to shoot it at a specific angle so the recoil will knock the Earth, the Earth's axis. So right now the Earth is tilted on its axis. So this would untilt it. And effectively it would melt all the polar ice caps. So some continents would be drowned, others would become larger. And it would have the effect of like basically erasing all seasons. Everybody would get the same amount of daylight and darkness, et cetera, and that this would solve a bunch of problems. But the reason they're doing it is because these 3 men had bought up all of the like coal deposits under the Arctic Circle for cheap, and so they were going to be able to access them. And anyway, the whole scheme ends up not actually going off because of a rounding error, which ultimately meant that the cannon that they would have needed to do this should have been like 1 trillion times larger than it was. Anyway, okay, so my point is that Jules Verne, who was very progressive, you could say, in the way that he approached technology, he still had a lot of, especially seems later on in life, he had a lot of skepticism and even a lot of like, was trying to put a satirical kind of look at all of this. So in First Men in the Moon, you have a similar kind of an idea where you have 2 people. One is an industrialist. This is really germane to our discussion of the Silent Planet. You have 2 people. One is an industrialist, and the other is basically a scientist. And they're both really obsessed with the idea of social reforms. And one of the things that they want to do, through this project of lunar travel, is to like land there and either bring about social change and social reform, or maybe even like get enough money, bring back enough treasure to kind of fund those sort of social reforms. And so they land there on the moon and they discover a few different things. One is that gold is incredibly plentiful on the moon. You can have as much of it as you want. And the other thing is that they encounter the selenites. And the selenites are these insect-like people who have a totally harmonious society. And the total harmony of their society comes through specialization. And so you have different selenites that are sort of born to different roles, kind of like in like a bee colony or something like that, where you have, physical chain form and shape and everything varies based on whatever your role in the society is. And the selenites, who are sentient, sort of like big sentient bugs, they achieve happiness by, in a society that's free from war, by everybody sticking to exactly what their role is and nobody moves outside of it, right? And so, you can ask yourself, like, what is Wells saying about what to him an idealized, anti-war society would look like? Well, one of the implications of this is something like the idea that it's individual it's individuality, or it's like a personal choice, or it's the sort of like freedom of the will, right? These are the things that are kind of causing war and humans and starvation and all the other things in human society. And so if we could kind of get away from those things, those social changes hinted at the beginning of the book, then maybe we could really get something going as a society, as a species. Mm-hmm. So Lewis writes Out of the Silent Planet, but instead of sending 2 people to, in this case, Mars or Malacandra, he sends 3 people. So as in H.G. Wells, you have a scientist and an industrialist. And the industrialist is mainly concerned, this is the character divide, he's mainly concerned with finding things, specifically extraterrestrial gold is what he's hoping to find that he can bring back with him. And then Weston, who is much more concerned with basically, and this is a little bit of a departure from H.G. Wells's story. He's unlike the scientist in Wells in that he is mainly concerned with the propagation of the human species, and this is what he sees at this particular time. Now we'll talk about this more when we do our next couple of videos, but the thing that he's particularly interested in at this time is spreading humanity across as many planets as possible. And as far as Weston is concerned, and this is echoing sentiments of Lewis's day that basically said, within the scientific community, who basically said that, as the only thing that matters is the propagation of the species, and everything else is justified if we can make things bigger, better, healthier. One of the things that Lewis mentions early on in this story, and mentions again many times throughout his other works, actually, because it was a big debate in England at his time, is the idea of vivisection, practiced either on animals or on human beings. There was a huge debate, like an ethical debate in the scientific community about, like, is it okay to cut things open while they're alive to look at how they work so that you can advance scientific knowledge, knowing that by doing so, you're inflicting, cruelty and harm and pain on another living being.
Yeah.
And Lewis was very strongly against vivisection, but that's the kind of thing that at the time where they would sort of justify, listen, we could prevent all of this hypothetical future suffering.
Yeah.
If we just, get rid of traditional morality.
Yeah. Early in the book, we learn kind of through an oblique reference by Divine that Weston had a dog once, and I think his name is actually Tartarus. He had the dog, but the dog's been vivisected. And Lewis mentions vivisection in a number of different contexts in his fictional and non-fictional work. If you kind of listen through his essays, there's like a long 50-hour collection. It's interesting that this kind of recurs for him as this, first step down a very dark path. If we can justify inflicting kind of extreme animal suffering in this way on the grounds that we're doing so, just the advancement of knowledge, the prevention of hypothetical future suffering, well, that's going to lead to a certain place, which is then kind of depicted for us, I think, in that hideous strength. So you're a medievalist, and obviously Lewis was deeply immersed in the medieval cosmos as well. So when Ransom climbs into this spaceship and they leave the atmosphere. Ransom's mind, Ransom, for those watching, haven't read the book for some reason, Ransom's mind is explicitly said to have been shaped by folks like H.G. Wells.
Yep.
You know, is his expectations.
And by the way, just for people who don't know, the subtext in Out of the Silent Planet is that H.G. Wells is not fiction in the setting. Like, it's like, you know, or at least it might have been published as fiction, but it's actually a real, you know, or like a semi-real account. And I think this gets revised a little bit in That Hideous Strength, but initially, you know, there are multiple references to First Men on the Moon in particular, and other things written by H.G. Wells, and characters don't seem to treat them as just fiction.
Yeah, and then there's, at the end of Out of the Silent Planet, you have this appendix where you have 2 letters which are ascribed to Ellen Ransom, the actual inspiration behind the story. And it's interesting that when Lewis is explaining to his readers the insinuation of factuality, he says Weston and Devine, they aren't their real names, but anybody who knows anything about anything will be able to figure out who I'm talking about. So there you get a pretty direct.
Yeah, there you go.
So Ransom, he's leaving the atmosphere. His mind, his expectations, even though he's a Christian, have been deeply shaped by the expectation that he's going to find indescribable horrors beyond the moon. And then, as he enters into space/heaven, he has this experience. I just want to read this passage because this passage, you know, there's certain things that just go into you and convert your imagination, in the sense that the images we form of the real world. And this one did that for me. So he's out there in space. He's not on Malacandran/Mars yet. And this is what he says. There was an endless night on one side of the ship, endless day on the other. Each was marvelous, and he moved from one to the other at his will and delighted. In the nights which he could create by turning the handle of a door, he lay for hours in contemplation of the skylight. The Earth's disk was nowhere to be seen. The stars, thick as daisies on an uncut lawn, reigned perpetually with no cloud, no moon, no sunrise to dispute their sway. There were planets of unbelievable majesty, constellations undreamed of. There were celestial sapphires, rubies, emeralds, pinpricks of burning gold. Far out on the left of the picture hung a comet, tiny and remote. And between all and behind all, far more emphatic and palpable than it showed on Earth, the undimensioned enigmatic blackness. The lights trembled. They seemed to grow brighter as he looked. Stretched naked on his bed, a second Danae, he found it night by night more difficult to disbelieve in the old astrology. Almost he felt, wholly he imagined sweet influence pouring or even stabbing into his sundered body. And so here, Ransom experiences a conversion from space, which is what he was expecting, and heaven, which is what he finds, this realm of indescribable light. And Lewis is explicit in the appendix that really what he wants to do for his readers, if nothing else, is to move them over from thinking of out there as space to thinking of it as heaven. So how does Lewis take us into the world that was assumed by the medievals?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing that he does is just by kind of, as Lewis often does, he begins by just sort of building in some layers of, let's say, rewriting or repainting popular images. And so at this particular point in time, Lewis writes about this somewhere else, but the use of the word space itself is the way that word is changed in the English language. It basically goes back to Milton. Milton is the first person, as far as I know, to use the word, at least in print, at least that we remember, to use the word space to talk about distance, you know, like three-dimensional space, rather than time. In Old and Middle English, a space is a short unit of time, right? And Milton is really the first person to kind of give us these images of sort of like vast expanses of starless, you know, the void between the stars, so to speak. And that's owing to things that were happening in the popular imagination. Milton didn't invent that, but he obviously, is a very good poet. He definitely kind of popularizes that image. And this is something Lewis knew quite well, wrote about quite a bit. We have to remember that Lewis's real specialty was 16th century English literature, which is what he wrote the Ohel volume for, and it's what he, kind of a lot of his more scholarly or academic essays are particularly on the poetry and the prose of the 16th century. So anyway, all that to say, there was this popular idea in the imagination at this point in time of, the vastness of space, right? We're starting to use billions as actually a really fun thing to do is go do like a Google Ngram of the word billion, which really sort of picks up even in any kind of a popular use in like the 50s and 60s, from what I recall. It's been a while since I looked, but we're starting to use billions both as a unit of distance, talking about the billions of miles of endless space or whatever, and then also the as a unit of time, talking about the Earth and the cosmos and everything being billions and billions of years old, and the Big Bang and all this different stuff. This stuff was rushing in on the imagination so rapidly at this point in time that it kind of created its own really potent mythology with its own potent mythological images, and still does, obviously. Lewis was one of the first people to kind of realize that this was functionally a new religion. It was functionally a new set of religious terminology and imagery to use to describe the world. And so the first thing that he's concerned with doing is trying to take the initial way that you think about outer space. Now, I've never been in outer space. God willing, I'll never go. However, there is a kind of a, and I've never actually even talked to anybody's, but I've never sat down and had a conversation with an astronaut. Like, how bright is it? How dark is it? Obviously, my understanding, at least, is that they don't have just a ton of windows on those things. Mm-hmm. And I imagine a lot has to do with your position, since there's no atmosphere. And anyway, all these different things. But the way that Lewis describes it is very, imaginatively potent. And it doesn't really matter whether or not, if you got on a space shuttle and flew up into the, beyond Earth atmosphere, that you'd sort of see everything exactly the same way. But the point is that the first thing he tries to do is to show just how full it is. Yeah. Right. And this is the number one defining feature of the medieval conception of the heavens, is that their fullness. Mm-hmm. Now, the next step that he goes after kind of doing that initial layer is to kind of begin to counter the way that you might think about an alien planet. And so, again, H.G. Wells' The First Men in the Moon is a really good example. Actually, probably because H.G. Wells wrote that story, Lewis doesn't have you go to the moon. He has to go to Mars, or Malacandra, as it's called in Old Solar. Yeah. And on Mars, or on Malacandra, Lewis does a very effective job, and it's very much in the vein of science fiction at the time. Was mostly published in magazines, and it was really kind of sort of niche kind of stuff for people who were really into that sort of thing. Lewis was really into that sort of thing, and he subscribed to and he read a lot of these magazines. And the way that he describes like the sort of like Malacandran terrain and atmosphere is very similar to the way that people speculated life on Mars might be. The idea that you have the basically the barren desert, and then in the canals of Mars, basically there would be like vegetation and water and life and everything else there. And at the time, that was a very popular theory, or at least in the popular imagination.
Yeah, I think it started in the 19th century. Yeah. Of course, our telescopes were less powerful then, and people observed things which they interpreted to be canals, which they interpreted to be evidence of civilization. There used to be, maybe it's still around, a website, which I really recommend people check out if they can find it, called the Old Solar System, because our conception of what the solar system could be like has been so shaped by the probes that have been out there. But it's just fascinating because this website compiles lots of different visions of what the various different worlds could be like before we actually had probes and the powerful telescopes that we have today.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look that out, check that out, because it sounds rad.
If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting this channel as a patron or paid Substack subscriber. I post reflections on Scripture 6 days a week, and 3 of these posts are exclusive to those who are patrons or paid subscribers on Substack at $5 per month. At $10 per month, patrons have access both to all of my written content as well as to weekly exclusive videos of about a half hour per week. At $30 per month, patrons have access to all of the preceding as well as a weekly class on the Old Testament of about an hour to an hour and a half each. Finally, at $35 per month, patrons receive access to all of my written and recorded exclusive content, as well as the ability to schedule monthly calls of 1 hour every month as long as you remain a patron at this level. You can also access these benefits through channel memberships on YouTube. Please also consider purchasing my lecture sets, Answering Protestantism from the Bible, 17 hours, and Answering Calvinism from the Bible, 6.5 hours. These can be purchased either individually or together for a discount. All links are in the description box and pinned comment. Your support, both financially and especially through your daily prayers, is what enables me to produce regular, high quality, and original content. Thank you so much.
Anyway, yeah, so he gets it's interesting, as you point out, that in certain respects, Lewis is saying something that's very much intelligible to somebody who's immersed in the popular imagination. And that makes it all the more potent when Ransom is surprised by the world that he encounters. There's another passage here, since you've mentioned his actual kind of arrival on Mars or Malacandra, that I just want to read here, because this one again had a big influence on just the way that I began to see things. And this is: the ship is now entering the Martian atmosphere. Suddenly, the lights of the universe seemed to be turned down. As if some demon had rubbed the heavens' face with a dirty sponge, the splendor in which they had lived for so long blenched to a pallid, cheerless, pitiable gray. It was impossible from where they sat to open the shutters or roll back the heavy blind. What had been a chariot gliding in the fields of heaven became a dark steel box, dimly lighted by a slit of window, and falling. He wondered how he could have ever thought of planets, even of the earth, as islands of life and reality, floating in a deadly void.
Right.
Now, with a certainty which never deserted him, he saw the planets as mere holes or gaps in the living heaven, excluded and rejected wastes of heavy matter and murky air, formed not by addition to, but by subtraction from the surrounding brightness. And this passage, I think, in a way that just kind of articulating in a systematic form the medieval view of the world couldn't. This helped me to see how the order of being that we're used to thinking of could have been seen in a completely inverted way by medievals, where heaven really is all about life, and the earth really is this realm of instability and change and death and
yeah. Instability and change is the main sort of really important defining feature of the medieval way of thinking about, the world underneath the moon, basically, like the sublunar reality, you could call it, in the Middle Ages. So Lewis does apply some of that to Malacandra, but then we're going to find out later that it's different in Malacandra. Mm-hmm. There is death in Malacandra, but not the way that we have it here. And there is definitely, the potential for corruption, but it's not endemic the way that it is here. And we're going to find out, all the different reasons for this. Basically it's, the devil. That's the short version. But that the devil is he's the ruler, the principality of the planet Earth, or Tholcandra, the silent planet. Mm-hmm. And it's silent because there's an embargo, let's say, right? There's a blockade around the moon, right? And so things don't, the evil spirits on Earth can't leave to go into the heavens, and it's not until Christ comes and that the blockade is sort of broken. Yeah. But that the silence that we perceive, and this is the flip that Lewis is trying to get you to do. It's an almost Chestertonian reversal, except that Chesterton would have done it as a throwaway line, and Lewis is like, this would be a great premise for a series of novels. But it's the flip is saying, actually, if it seems like the heavens are silent, right? Because this is one of the things that you could sort of ask, and that people were asking, right? Some, the famous communist cosmonaut who got up there and looked around and said, "Oh, I've been up there. I've been to outer space. I didn't see God." So obviously can't be there, right? And so this is one of the things that people were kind of throwing around at this time, is this idea that, well, the heavens are totally silent. So, and even things like SETI and stuff like that are, this constant search for meaning, this hope that there's going to be some kind of a principality, some kind of a source of meaning beyond our own world, right?
Yeah.
And this is, it's a really deep human hope that ultimately should prepare us for Christ. And in the scientific age, when we'd already sort of rejected, Christianity, Christ, angels, et cetera, or, said, well, maybe they were aliens or whatever, then the idea became, well, maybe we can find some kind of a materialistic source of meaning out there somewhere in the cosmos, even if we don't have it here among us.
Yeah.
And so, so one of the first things Lewis is really doing, so once he kind of clears away the cobwebs of that initial picture of space as empty, the next thing he tries to do is show, actually, if it seems like there's not meaning in the cosmos, it's because we're the ones that are cut off,
right?
And the thing that has cut us off is basically the demons. It's basically sin. It's basically our fall, and the fact that we are more or less quarantined. I mean, one of the things that Lewis is very adamant about in his letters and in his nonfiction work is that he really strongly believes that it would be a terrible thing for humanity to ever go and try to colonize some other planet.
Yeah.
Because we would just end up taking all of our evil with us into the rest of the universe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
it's always struck me that even though we went to the moon in 1969, we actually haven't passed beyond the moon, which I just think is kind of an intriguing thing, if that really is.
It is pretty interesting. We keep throwing probes at things, but I don't want to say we'll never make it to Mars or whatever, but we can't even survive conditions on our own planet right now, let alone. But what I do want to point out, though, is that even this idea is not, this is not where Ransom stays. Like, he doesn't stay at this thinking, oh, well, the planets are actually this horrible empty void or whatever. They're, matter that actually, so this kind of goes back to what I was saying a moment ago. When he lands in Malacandran, he's able, you gradually see all the sort of tropes from science fiction of the time about, which can go one of two ways. It could go sort of like a very, let's say, chauvinistic, humanity should go and colonize these other planets, which is certainly there in plenty of the literature of the era. Or on the flip side, the fact that, humanity is pitiful and awful and has nothing to offer. And Lewis doesn't really do either one of those things. But what Lewis actually does is to use the creatures of Malacandra to give you an idea or an image of, it's an alternate view of humanity in a certain way. It is very much I think, a response to the first Men on the Moon, in the way that the Selenites in First Men on the Moon have a really stratified society, and basically, the idea that it's like a totally planned society, basically, which was, you think about everything happening in the 20th century, both fascism and socialism are hugely interested in the idea of a planned society, right? That we're going to control means of production, and we're going to, nationalize certain industries, and we're going to totally plan the society. But when you're born, we'll already know through, eugenics, through, genetic testing, through all these different things, we'll know exactly where to assign you. And then your happiness will come by filling that position that was assigned to you from birth, right? Lewis gives a kind of a different version of that. So where we have basically three sentient races living alongside each other, and one of them is sages. And then there are basically like sages, or you could think of like scientists, and then there's a kind of a mechanical, race that has to deal with like the earth and metallurgy, and then in between them, kind of the if you want to think of a heart mediating between a mind and a stomach, right, or something like that. Then you have the Xhosa, the I don't know, they're like warrior poet beaver horses.
Yeah.
Which is just a delightful thing to even say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they're the heart that kind of mediates between, something like the Platonic ideal of the human, of the human body, right? That you've got the mind and you've got the stomach. And the stomach is the part of you that's might seem weird to like associate technology with that, but you got to remember that technology in the ancient world is always associated with like stuff coming up from below, right? All the forge gods are cripples, and they all live, under the mountain, right?
Yeah.
And then you have like the sages, the people who are like focused on the stars. They live up where the air is literally thin.
Yeah.
They're and then in between them, so in between the mind and the stomach, you've got to have the heart that sort of mediates. And this race is the race that is specifically good at poetry.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got like thinky people and doey people, and in the middle you have poetry, which is somewhere in between those two things, right? They're very action oriented, but they're also reflective, right? And so that's the what Lewis is actually doing is giving us a way of thinking about humanity, about a different way of thinking about civilization and the way that civilization could work. And he's really kind of setting up on almost a medieval caste system, in the sense that, like the three kinds of people in the Middle Ages are, of course, those who sing, or those who pray, those who work, those who pray, those who fight. This is something like that. It's not exactly along the same, stratification, but it's not hard to see the kind of the connection between those three things. So
Yeah.
Anyway, I just say all that to say Lewis continues kind of work within the conventions of the genre that he has, but then putting this sort of medieval twist on it and say, actually, you could have a society, and in this case, a theocracy, which is beautifully managed, and in which everybody is born content with the place that they've been given and the role that they have to play.
Yeah. There's a really wonderful passage when Ransom goes and he's taken to the village of the Harassa, and then he begins to learn enough of their language, which is the language of all three species on Malacandran. He begins to learn enough of the language to begin to learn about their society, and they learn about his. And I think, what comes through for me in these conversations is Lewis is communicating the naturalness of nature here, right? Because certain things which we take for granted as just the disposition of life, or the natural tendency of existence, are just strike the Rasa as incredibly strange. Right?
Yeah.
So he says, well, what if the other beings want food that you're going to grow?
Or like, what do you mean you don't want to have sex all the time?
Yeah. It's like, isn't it a great pleasure? So they, yeah. So what does that mean? Or why wouldn't we give food to those who need the food? I mean, a lot of the questions that seem to be so vexing for Ransom don't even make any sense. And one of the things that really struck me is the way in which the Harassa do not distinguish what we consider to be just kind of ridiculous nonsense from, terrible crimes. So he asks about sexual promiscuity. And then the Haras compares the tendency towards sexual promiscuity towards, the tendency to just eat dirt or something. Right. Makes no sense whatsoever.
Right. So that there would be like the potential that they don't have actually a word for bad, right? They just have the word bent, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you're supposed to be going this way, and then you end up, missing the mark, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love these passages. I think they're as a kid, they were almost my favorite part of the book, is just because it's a way of holding up a mirror to, and this is what science fiction, this is one of the goals of science fiction, you could say, as a genre, is to hold up a mirror to the way that things are now, right?
Yeah.
And to imagine how they could be better. And there's a very humanist way of doing this. But Lewis does it in a very humane way, let's say.
Yeah.
So,
actually, you can find Orthodox icons of the 7 planetary archangels. So could you just tell us a little bit about this idea of planetary archons and what Lewis is trying to communicate
Yeah.
when he speaks about this hierarchy?
So this is the third sort of step in Lewis's project of rehabilitating our vision of the heavens, right? Is to introduce the idea of sort of personalized archons, or personalized personifications of planets. And later on, Lewis will extend this idea in Paralandra, in the climax of Paralandra, and also in that hideous strength. Lewis will expand upon this idea and use it to basically explain why it is that certain planets are associated with certain gods, and that these associations are so strong that they were carried into Christianity without alteration, and without even being considered a problem. It was just sort of like, obviously, you'd have to talk about the world in these terms. How else would you do it? So Lewis develops this idea that the planets have these certain personal attributes and even influences,
Yeah.
you could say, on people on Earth, which they still do. I mean, we've talked about this before, but the very fact that you observe, the months of the year or something like that, means the stars and planets are influencing your life in a certain way.
Yeah.
If you've decided this is the month of August and I'm going to behave as though it's the month of August, you're allowing the stars and planets, one planet in particular, the moon, to kind of dictate your life and your experience of time. And we have used technology. A calendar is a kind of technology. We've used technology like calendars and other things to sort of rationalize this stuff and kind of like put a buffer between ourselves and the cosmos. Mm-hmm. But if, tomorrow we dropped you on a desert island, or EMP drops and all of the podcasts go away, or something happens, right? And suddenly you don't have access to a calendar and you have to go to making one. How are you going to make a calendar? Well, actually, we know exactly how you're going to make a calendar, because everybody, no matter where they live, more or less comes up with one or two kinds of calendars, and they always have basically the same length of year. This is, I mean, there might be some outliers out there that I'm not thinking about right now, but this is pretty darn consistent, right? Pretty much everybody uses, the moon to determine the month and so on. So anyway, and there are different ways of reconciling the little differences between like the solar year and the lunar year and things like that. Everybody has slightly different ways of solving these problems, but everybody's experience of time as dictated by the stars and the planets is virtually identical.
Yeah.
So,
and there's a passage near the end where he's at Meldalorn, which is essentially, though it's not a one-to-one kind of analogy, essentially the capital. This is where Oyarsa, the archon of Mars, meets with his people, all three of these species, and he sees this very ancient engraving, which he perceives is a representation of the solar system. And he sees Mercury the first, and then he sees Venus, and he says, what an extraordinary coincidence, thought Ransom, that their mythology, like ours, associates some idea of the female with Venus. And Paralandra, Ransom muses that perhaps the distinction between mythology and history, or mythology and reality, is purely terrestrial. So what is Lewis implying about the nature of the celestial archetypes, if we can call it?
Let me kind of carry through on my earlier thought, because this will kind of get us there. So in the very early Christian writing, and we have to believe this is inherited from sources before Christianity, but in very early Christian writing, for instance, I believe this is in St. Irenaeus's On the Apostolic Preaching. Right. One of the ways that the devil, or that Satan, is talked about is as being the archon, and that's the word used, as being the archon of this world. Right? That is the sort of like the angelic power, or the angelic principality, responsible for governing the world that God created. Right. And that he's the one that falls. And this is why the scriptures call him, among other things, like the ruler of this world, the prince and the power of the air. Yeah. And so on. So, I mean, that's a very kind of what Lewis does then is a very natural extension of this kind of ancient Christian idea, which is to extend it in the direction of the other planets, right? The other planets of the sort of classical planets, of which there are 7. And he extends it in their direction and says, well, if there's an archon governing this one, maybe there are archons governing these other planets. And then he looks at and he's got actually a pretty intricate sort of explanation for how this works at the end of Paralandra. So we'll talk about it more when we get there. But basically this idea that, yeah, Venus is feminine, right? Maybe not female, but it's definitely feminine, right? And Mars is definitely masculine. And Mars is the warrior and Venus is the mother. And like some of these certain associations go really deep. And for Lewis, this stuff is really intricately connected. There's a great book out there people should read called Planet Narnia. I sort of assume everybody who wants to be a Lewis scholar of any kind has probably read this book. I will say when I first read the book, I was like, I don't know about this so much. And then every time I've read the book since then, it becomes more and more true. There's also a great St. Silouan reference at the end for people who might have missed that at some point in the past. But Ward does an amazing job tracing the sort of the lines and the associations. But basically, it's something like each archon lends its personality to the world, right? Or as a manifestation, you could say, of the personality of the world, or however you want to say it. And our archon, the dark archon, right? The reason our world is called the silent planet is because our archon fell and attacked other worlds, in particular attacked Malacandran or Mars, right? And so as a result of that attack, he's sort of quarantined, that there's a barrier that he can't cross beyond the moon, and that he's locked in there. So that's the idea that Lewis puts forward, and he's going to develop this idea further in this book and in future books. He's going to develop that idea to basically kind of explain why these ideas, why these, you could call them like cosmic archetypes, like personalities, personal archetypes, etc., why they are so sticky, right? Why they're so compelling, why we seem to not be able to get away from them, and why, but also like the ways in which they're consistent with a Christian cosmology.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating the way that he's able to take kind of the stuff of the world that we're familiar with and kind of reveal a world in which meaning is embedded into the intrinsic stuff of the world in which we live and move. So if someone has just read, say, Out of the Silent Planet, what's the most important thing that they should be taking away from it?
That's an interesting question. I think to begin with, this idea of not space but the heavens, this is really important, and it becomes easier actually for us than it was in Lewis's day, right? In Lewis's time, they still had sort of the idea of a fairly fixed, fairly static solar system, whereas we actually know that's sort of not the case. At least we think it's maybe not the case anymore. There are some fun models out there. You can find the computer-generated models that actually show the solar system as we now sort of think it is, and what we actually see is that not even the sun is stationary, right? But the sun is actually, is spiraling like this through the galaxy, and then kind of drawing along all the planets in his wake, and they're all sort of spiraling in these intricate patterns. And I think the idea that you're going to get even more in Paralandra is this idea of the great dance, right? This idea that the heavens are full of meaning, everything in the heavens obeys the will of God. All these kind of different ways of thinking about things. I think another fun thing to kind of take away from Out of the Silent Planet would be like a Christian return to, or a Christian appropriation of the science fiction genre. I think that Lewis does this really successfully, and basically nobody else has really done it since then. I mean, there've been plenty of, I read plenty of bad attempts, as a kid, but these are not books anybody's going to remember. Lewis's gifts here are really unique, and then he's able to combine, as you said, a Christian cosmology. In this case, he uses medieval cosmology because it's inherently Christian. He's able to combine Christian cosmology with what science accepts at the time. Of course, he does some science fiction things with it. Lewis is not himself a scientist. He'd be the first person to tell you this. So he tries not to like go too far in that direction. It's not a work of hard sci-fi, for instance. But he is really he reads a lot of hard sci-fi, right? So he's at least really interested in what are the genre conventions, right? And then that's the third thing that he integrates, which is sort of the genre conventions of the science fiction genre. And I think it would be a pretty interesting project to look in and see, like, well, what's the science fiction that people are really interested in right now, or like what does the genre look now, and then how would you retell that within a Christian cosmos? I mean, my own storytelling, I've done a lot of work on stories in the superhero genre. Hopefully, maybe have some more things along those lines coming out in the near future, where I tried to do a sort of a similar thing, where I set, taking the superhero genre, which is in some ways the quintessential American genre, as opposed to, some other form of storytelling, and trying to cast that back into a more traditional medieval cosmology as well. So I think that Lewis lays out the blueprint for how this could be done well. You don't have to do it exactly like he did it, but I do really love. I also just, like, as a philologist myself, I just really love all the little linguistic stuff in here, and when he's like fantasizing about like a concise Martian dictionary and things like this, it's like that stuff all kind of warms my heart. But that's sort of also Lewis doing the thing that he can do, which is he's not really equipped to talk about the physics of the whole thing. So he basically just has Weston be too arrogant to explain it to us, but then he is interested in things like language and theology. And so he's able to, kind of go deeper into it. And this is another thing I would say is, if you're a creative type yourself, play to the strengths. If you just want to read stories, then I would say the main thing to take away would be this idea of the heavens, and also this idea of the planets, right? As such, the idea of the planets as such. The idea of the planets, by the way, in Judaism and Christianity itself is quite complicated. Planet is originally the Greek word used for a fallen angel, because a planet is a wandering star, right? So it's a star that forsook its, right? How does it? Yeah, right. And that word appears in the book of Jude, by the way, the word planet. So it kind of goes from there to being, kind of develops from this idea that, well, every fallen star is a demon, which is what you kind of find in the book of Enoch, and it's because the planets are themselves associated with they're associated with with faults with pagan gods, right? That's in the book of Enoch. And then they're able to sort of take that and carry it forward and sort of build upon that, but also kind of rehabilitate the planets a certain way in the medieval world. So but I think that there's a beautiful moment in the kind of the two letters at the end, right? There's this beautiful moment where he's talking about Jupiter, and he's like, oh, this is one of the things I should have mentioned, is the way that Jupiter, they think about Jupiter and they see Jupiter as like sort of like, it's very strongly implied that Malacandran might be like the Archangel Michael, or at least a very like Michael-like figure. But there's this implication that Jupiter, like whatever archon resides there, is this really grandiose, like really amazing thing. And we get a little bit, we don't really revisit that again until that hideous strength. But but I think being able to look up in the sky and sort of see the stars and planets as being things that do mean something, and it's so hard. It's so hard to explain to people or convince people that you could do this without falling into just like wacky, astrology column in the newspaper or whatever, right? And I mean, one of the sort of problems with anytime you turn somebody onto like a symbolic way of viewing the world is that it takes them a little while to get the dials adjusted. And so they So they first go from 0 to 10, and suddenly they just see meaning in everything all the time. And there is meaning in everything all the time. But also, you can go too far and read in stuff that's not there, or you can see that there's meaning, but then misunderstand what that meaning is,
Right.
or misunderstand, there's also like a prioritization of meaning that is something that is supposed to happen as part of the Christian life.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I love about Lewis is that his protagonist, Ransom, is himself like such a normal guy. Like, he's very level-headed. He's a normal guy. He's although, he has these flights of poetic fancy and everything else, he's typically thinking about things that we should be thinking about, like, how do I love my neighbor, and where's my next meal coming from, and those kinds of things, as a and then he has these moments of intuition where everything kind of clicks together, and that's what you're building towards, hopefully, as you try to recover this worldview for yourself, or as you try to at least recover some kind of an appreciation of the heavens as the heavens, is that you don't push too hard on trying to decode everything. Like, don't think of it as like a code you have to crack, but rather just start to see it as meaning, start to see there being as a place where there's beauty and meaning, and begin to study a little bit. Even things like just being able to recognize which stars are where and at what time of year and stuff like that, like basic naked eye astronomy. Just sort of start there with the dry stuff, and then what you'll find is, once you start to recover this, you will you'll have these moments of intuition where things sort of click together, and you'll kind of start to see where things fit into a larger cosmic great dance. So that's kind of my pitch for that. I have to say, like, because I live in the city, it's hard to see a lot of stars, and we do try to get out to the country every so often and do some naked eye astronomy with the kids, but it's hard. And this is not something. This is the part of the traditional imaginary that is the hardest for me to appropriate personally. But I mean, you can just start with things like, without looking, in the middle of the day, without looking it up on the internet, do you know what phase of the moon we're in? Right. And do like basic things like that. So
yeah. Well, thank you, Richard. As you alluded to, we'll have Richard back on to talk about Paralandra and that hideous strength. So if you haven't read these books, make sure to read them, then watch the discussions, and thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Sarah.
If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting this channel as a patron or paid Substack subscriber. I post reflections on Scripture 6 days a week, and 3 of these posts are exclusive to those who are patrons or paid subscribers on Substack at $5 per month. At $10 per month, patrons have access both to all of my written content as well as to weekly exclusive videos of about a half hour per week. At $30 per month, patrons have access to all of the preceding as well as a weekly class on the Old Testament of about an hour to an hour and a half each. Finally, at $35 per month, patrons receive access to all of my written and recorded exclusive content, as well as the ability to schedule monthly calls of 1 hour every month as long as you remain a patron at this level. You can also access these benefits through channel memberships on YouTube. Please also consider purchasing my lecture sets, Answering Protestantism from the Bible, 17 hours, and Answering Calvinism from the Bible, 6.5 hours. These can be purchased either individually or together for a discount. All links are in the description box and pinned comment. Your support, both financially and especially through your daily prayers, is what enables me to produce regular, high quality, and original content. Thank you so much.